Hi guys, Buildzoid here from Actually Hardcore Overclocking, and today we're going to be taking a look at the RTX 2080 Ti Strix PCB from ASUS. And as you can clearly see, this is not an NVIDIA reference PCB or a Founders Edition PCB as they like to call it now. It's a bloody reference card. You can stop pretending it isn't. It still doesn't have more phases than any of the custom models. But yeah, so this is the first of the custom PCBs, and I rather like it. It has some pretty this actually has straight upgrades on like every front compared to the Founders Edition.
Before that, this video is brought to you by PowerColor's Red Dragon Vega 56, which is now below MSRP on Newegg at $380 with a rebate from the 28th to the 30th of September. When we first tested Vega 56, we found the card competitive and fun for tweaking and modding, and now that it's back in stock, it's worth consideration. Vega 56 also comes with 3 free games, including Assassin's Creed Odyssey, Star Control, and Strange Brigade, while supplies last. Learn more at the link below.
I'm going to say that you're never going to notice these improvements on this PCB over the Founders Edition unless you're maybe doing LN2 overclocking. There you might notice. Or maybe even with dry ice you might notice a difference, but on like air cooling, water cooling, and without any physical modifications of the card, you're not going to see a difference between this PCB and the Founders Edition. That's not to say that this isn't a better PCB. This definitely is better. So let's get right into why this is better. So first of all, same as the Founders Edition, ASUS is using the Vcore VRM sort of on either side of the GPU core. So you have one block of Vcore VRM phases over here, and you have the other block of phases over there. So that's your Vcore, and as usual, the memory VRM is located right above that. So that's VMem up there. Over here in the top, we have 5 volts and 1.8 volts. So 1.8 volts is for things like the BIOS, chips that NVIDIA uses, and I just realized that the circle goes into the Vcore there. But there's so you have one regulator for 5 volts and 1.8 volts right here. And this is for basically things like the BIOS chips that NVIDIA uses. This is for actually powering the VRM itself, because the VRM these power stages, they don't run off of 12 volts or 3.3 volts. They actually need to run off of 5 volts. So that's why there's a 5 volt regulator up there. Down here we have the PEX rail. So that powers the PCIe interface as well as some internal PLLs of the GPU core. And over here we have, in a rather odd location, we have the USB-C power. So that's for the USB Type-C port on the card right here on the rear I/O. So that's what powers that. And yeah, that pretty much covers the major VRMs scattered around, actually all of the VRMs scattered around the card. You of course still have the power balancing circuitry, same as the Founders Edition. So you have 12 volt balancing over here. And that's still controlled by the same chips as on the Founders Edition. So the controller for this is again a UP7651Q, and that's a 2-channel 12 volt power management IC. Basically, it just switches where some of these phases. Again, I'm not sure without the card in hand. I don't if I had the card in hand, I could actually check how that is wired. But without the card in hand, I just know some of the phases in this block of in this part of the Vcore VRM are going to be able to basically switch if they pull their power from this connector or this connector, and maybe between the PCIe slot as well. I'm not entirely sure. Again, without the card in hand, I can't see the internal power planes and how they're interconnected. I wish I had that kind of power. That would actually be really awesome, but I don't. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't know how that is specifically wired up. And the same goes for the 12 volt balance right here. So I'm just going to put BAL for short there. So yeah, that's the balancing circuitry. So same as the Founders Edition. And other interesting things is ASUS has a BIOS switch up here, which basically puts you between a quiet mode and a performance mode. So that is an actual BIOS switch, because that's really the only way to implement any kind of like multiple like profile system on a GPU is you need multiple BIOS chips, because you can't on the fly change a lot. Well, I guess you could maybe change the fan profile with a switch, but you couldn't really do anything like change clocks or power targets with a switch on the card that didn't actually just straight up change which BIOS chip you were on. So you do have dual BIOS on this card just because ASUS wanted that feature, which is pretty neat. Dual BIOS is nice if you're into like tinkering with flashing different cards' BIOSes onto your card, which can be useful if you're trying to find like if you come across a BIOS for a 2080 Ti that has a much higher power limit than what your card's normal BIOS would normally allow. This can be useful for like trying that out without running the risk of completely bricking your card. So that's a nice feature to have. And then another feature that ASUS put on this card, and I am very surprised that NVIDIA still lets them do this, are these voltage mod points right here. I'm a huge fan of these things, but as you can clearly see, NVIDIA didn't actually let them label these properly. But I hope that ASUS, because, well, I'm hoping that ASUS will put down some LN2, scores with a 2080 Ti. And when they do that, they'll hopefully release to the public how these are specifically wired up. And I'm going to assume that, like in typical ASUS fashion, the only way to get these points to actually be enabled is to short these pads right here. And they've been doing this on their cards for years, like all the way back to at least the 500 series of NVIDIA GPUs. They've been doing this. You can also find it on their AMD GPUs, and it's, in my opinion, a really, really cool feature. I'm really surprised NVIDIA still lets them do this, but at least, apparently they're not letting them label these anymore, because normally they'd be labeled something like Vcore, VMEM, VPLL, and they would give you voltage controls for like the PEX rail, the Vcore, and the memory rail. But yeah, that would be far too that would give you far too many control options for your $1,200 GPU that you just bought from a store. So yeah, they can't actually tell you how those work. So that's a pretty cool feature. Then they have some LED on-off stuff, which I don't really care about. And yeah, ASUS is still only on just 2 8-pins, which I'm kind of sad about, but on the other hand, for like your daily usage, like air cooling, water cooling, it really won't make a difference. The card's not going to pull enough power to really, unless you do like physical modifications, the card's not going to be able to pull enough power to overload 2 8-pins. So for normal users, I completely understand why they didn't bother with putting like a third 8-pin or something, because really for 99, like for everybody who buys this card, that would be completely bloody irrelevant. It wouldn't actually do anything. So yeah, that kind of covers the minor interesting feature stuff around the card. Let's take a closer look at the actual VRMs. So for Vcore, ASUS is going from the 13 phase that you find on the Founders Edition to a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 phase. So 3 phases more than the Founders Edition. But other than that, they've made other changes. For example, ASUS has added a whole bunch of extra bulk capacitance, which I assume ends like that. So you basically get a bunch of extra bulk capacitors for the Vcore. And you actually still have if you, these capacitors on the back, so these, I assume these are going to be aluminum polymers. A lot of people would say, a lot of people think these are tantalum polymer capacitors, but that's most of the time, they can be, but a lot of this is probably a tantalum polymer, but these are almost certainly aluminum polymers. And the reason why those are used is they're actually, in terms of sort of output filtering for a switching power supply like a VRM, these are actually superior to tantalum polymer capacitors. So yeah, and there's actually the same number of these capacitors on the 2080 Ti Strix as there are on the 2080 Ti Founders Edition. So ASUS actually managed to literally just add more capacitors on top of what you would normally get on the Founders Edition, which is kind of interesting because initially you'd think, oh, they just replaced all the capacitors that NVIDIA had in aluminum, like in the SMD package, in the flat SMD packages. Nah, they kept those. They're all on the back, as well as you have some on the front here. And then they added all of these on top of that. I don't know how much of a difference that actually makes. Probably maybe like 10, 20 megahertz on, like if you tested 100 cards, you might see like a 10 megahertz, 20 megahertz difference. Generally speaking, extra capacitance helps more as you crank up your power consumption. But considering how power limited these cards are and the fact that they probably don't scale with Vcore, again, you know, it's nice. Like it is, you know, definitely an upgrade. It's just, I don't think you're going to notice that there is a difference. It's kind of like shaving 10 kilograms of weight off of a supercar. It does, like, yeah, it's lighter by 10 kilograms. It's not actually going to make a difference to like not make a noticeable difference to the user. So those are some of the upgrades ASUS has done, but there's more upgrades. So not only have they gone from the weird 13 phase to a weird 16 phase, and the reason why this is a weird 16 phase is that, yes, indeed, the voltage controller is still the same MP 2888. So 10 phases, 500 megahertz, 5 megahertz switching frequency, not 500. That would be ridiculous. And this is actually running in 10 phase mode. So they do actually have like 10 phases interleaving. The thing is, there's going to be some phases on here which actually have multiple power stages hooked up to them, which means this is not really a 16. This doesn't have 16 phases interleaving. It has 10. But some of the phases might be coming and going depending on how much load the card is under. So, you know, it's kind of this weird hybrid thing where it's like, it's not really a 16, but it's not really a 10 either, because it does kind of dynamically change how many phases it has. So yeah, and that's the same monolithic power systems chip that you had on the Founders Edition. Which actually, interesting side note, apparently there's Founders Edition's 2080 Ti's with a UP9512, which is actually an 8-phase controller, not a 10-phase. So that's kind of interesting. You can actually get 2 different variants of the Founders Edition. But I think for the ASUS Strix card, you're going to always get the MP2888. Just because if you'll notice that, like, if you saw the Founders Edition PCB analysis, then you'd notice that PCB looks almost like it's a prototyping card, because there are so many unoccupied solder points. Like, there is tons and tons of unused SMD component mounts, and that's basically because NVIDIA wants to be like, I assume that's done because they switched voltage controllers between Founders Editions. Like they do 2 different variants, with one with the UPI semiconductor chip and one with the monolithic power systems chip like this card. Anyway, the next upgrade that ASUS has done, yes, they're upgrading all the things, a small amount, but a noticeable amount, is that they've actually upgraded the power stages themselves as well. So on the Founders Edition, you'd have Fairchild Semiconductor's FDMF 3170 power stages. Here you get Texas Instruments CSD 95 that's not a 5, that's a 4. 95, that's not a 5 either. 95 480s. And these are also 70 amp smart power stages. So smart power stages are smart because they integrate things like temperature monitoring as well as very accurate current monitoring directly into the chips. And the cool thing about the CSD 95 480s is that these are actually, unlike the Fairchild chips, these are spec'd all the way up to 1.25 megahertz switching frequency, whereas the Fairchild ones were only up to 1 megahertz. And admittedly, they're not particularly efficient at that frequency, but they can do it. Like, they will work up to that, and if you were so inclined as to use them at that frequency, you can. And the really cool feature that, like, is just kind of insane is these have up to, like, these will do 95% efficiency or better, all the way up to 30 amps current output. So yeah, at the lower current outputs that this per phase, this VRM is not going to be pushing 30 amps for like a while. Like you'd need to lift the power limits and everything to get like average over 30 amps through each of these power stages. The end result is that this VRM is insanely efficient because these power stages are like, they're more efficient than what you get on the Founders Edition. So basically, like the Founders Edition VRM, I like already is massive overkill. It won't have any it shouldn't have any thermal issues. And in fact, in the thermal testings that Steve's done, the VRM ran at like 90 degrees, and we all know that the Founders Edition's cooling system is just kind of terrible as far as the VRM is concerned. I mean, it's covered by a vapor chamber that isn't really making great contact with it. So you can already see how the ridiculous VRM efficiency there pays off. You don't really need to worry about cooling the VRM because it kind of doesn't get hot to start with. But this just takes the whole not getting hot part a step further, because these are even more efficient and actually capable of going up to higher switching frequencies. So the end result is that this Vcore VRM pushing current into the core, and from both sides, and there are benefits to the funky VRM layout we have here that you don't normally see, and there are benefits, and I've explained them in the Founders Edition video. So if you want to hear about those, you can go watch the Founders Edition video. So for the actual current versus VRM efficiency capabilities, we still run into the issue of the VRM is rated entirely at 1.8 volts output voltage. So we're going to be doing 1.8 volts out and 1.2 volts out, which this is scaled against a IR3575. And that's just because that datasheet is convenient for me to use. I use the 3575 also for scaling down the FDMF 3170s. So this is very the ratings under the 1.2 volts are going to be very, it should probably be around something like that. They're not accurate. They're not dead on because they're just scaled off of a different chip's voltage, output voltage versus efficiency curve. And that may or may not be accurate at all. But it should be relatively close, and it's better than just, going with 1.8 volts, expect lower, which I got really sick and tired of, which I like, because all of these cards are using these 70 amp power stages. I've just kind of gotten sick of doing that, so it's just like, I don't want to do that. We're going to scale them down according to the 3575. For the actual operating parameters of the VRM, I'm going with 600 kilohertz switching frequency because the Texas Instrument datasheet is not actually spec'd at below 600 kilohertz whatsoever, and 5 volts drive voltage. Well, power voltage. We'll just call it 5 volts VCC. Not Vcore, that's 5 volts for the power of the actual power stages, because that's why we have that 5 volt rail on the card. Anyway, so the end result is that, say, 200 amps output current, which this, so 200 to sort of 300 amps, you're going to be looking at that current range for like stock settings. And at 200 amps, you'd be looking at around 17 watts of heat for 1.8 volts output. And at 1.2 volts, it would drop down to about 14 watts of heat. So basically this will run passive. You have you have less than 1 watt of heat per phase at 200 amps output. Now, when you go up to 300 amps, you start seeing about 26 watts of heat at 1.8 volts and about 21 watts of heat at 1.2 volts. So the interesting thing is actually 300 amps output, 1.2 volts is actually the same rating that the Founders Edition was getting for 200 amps, 1.8 volts, but admittedly the different voltages. So there's minor improvements compared to the Founders Edition. Like the Founders Edition at 1.8 volts, 200 amps was doing about 20 watts. This is doing 17, so 3 watts less. And at 1.2 volts, this is doing 14 instead of, if I remember correctly, something like 16 to 17 on the Founders Edition. So really not a huge improvement in these low current ranges. And the reason for that is basically as you keep adding phases, you basically your improvement in efficiency is much higher at higher currents. So at these 200 amp to 300 amp ranges, there's not that much difference. But as we start going up the current range, you're going to start seeing major drops in the bigger differences in the VRM efficiency from this to the Founders Edition. Obviously, you're not actually able to push this much power through these cards because NVIDIA doesn't allow the board partners to ship the cards with a high enough power limit, in my opinion at least. I don't think there's a single 2080 Ti out there that's going to have more than a 400 watt power limit, if even that. So yeah, and so far that looks to be exactly what's going on. So anyway, so for 400 amps, and at this point we're sort of getting into like 300 to 400, like 200 to 300 amps is going to be the sort of stock. Really around 250 is going to be stock on average. 300 to sort of 400 amps, I'm going to say, is overclocking on sort of air/water, without any kind of power modifications. If you did some power modifications, it's quite possible that you might exceed 400 amps. So 400 amps output, you'd actually be looking at about 37 watts of heat at 1.8 volts and about 30 watts of heat at 1.2. So, you know, great efficiency just across the board. These these smart power stages from TI are absolutely ridiculous. Now, 500 amps, you'd be looking at about 48 watts of heat, which is just like insane. Like, that is like very little heat output for how much current this VRM would be pushing. And still we're doing in like the high close to that 95% efficiency figure. Because yeah, these power stages are ridiculous. And then so 500 amps, 1.8 volts, 48 watts. At 1.2 volts, you'd be looking at more like 39 watts. 600 amps output, you're going to be looking at about 69 watts of heat. At 1.8 volts and about 55 watts of heat at 1.2 volts. And this is what basically I expect for like extreme overclocking. So dry ice or liquid nitrogen, especially a liquid nitrogen towards the bottom end of that. So, and then for finally at 700 amps, you'd be looking at about 96 watts of heat for 1.8 volts and about 77 watts of heat at 1.2 volts. So the crazy thing is the Founders Edition at 700 amps is actually around 125 watts of heat output. So that's where you start like seeing a pretty major drop in actual VRM heat output. And the end result is just like, honestly, like up to around like 500 amps output, this VRM should be perfectly fine if you just give it airflow in terms of like cooling concerns. So running this thing, like this card on like the Founders Edition already, I think you could totally run that on liquid nitrogen and not run into any major issues as long as you give it enough airflow. This, you might be even able to just like run benchmarks for like, you could potentially finish like stress tests on liquid nitrogen. Like the VRM here is insane. And especially if you still like, if you actually had some kind of like heatsink on top of the VRM and had airflow going through that, then yeah, this is going to handle absolutely ridiculous amounts of power. And it's not going to get hot. It's so damn out there. Like this is one of the most powerful VRMs on a GPU ever. This right here. Like even if you compare it to like a 980 Ti Hall of Fame or a 1080 Ti Hall of Fame, which both of those had 16-phase VRMs. Those were on 60 amp power stages. These are 70 amps. And those power stages, I think, were actually like not even capable of hitting that 95% efficiency figure that these can do in the lower current ranges basically at all. So these are like this VRM is amazing. It's just really unfortunate that, in the stock to the normal overclocking power draw ranges, you're not really going to notice that there's much of a difference with it. But yeah, ASUS has just gone above and beyond, and I really, really hope that we see some extreme overclocking results from them on this thing, because they have the voltage mod points. It's like, hopefully it's just a matter of time before somebody at ASUS decides to take one of these on LN2, because it's equipped for it. Like definitely really well equipped for that. Now then, let's move on to the memory VRM. For the memory VRM, the controller is a UP 9512, and it's some kind of weird variant of the 9512 because this is not the 8-phase version. So there's a 9512 that's an 8-phase. This one right here is actually only up to 4 phases. It's not the 8-phase flavor. And and that's because it's controlling the memory VRM, which is a 1, 2, 3 phase. And again, we're seeing the same, ridiculously overkill CSD 95480 power stages. So this memory VRM basically ends up in the same situation as the Founders Edition. Even if it was pushing 40 amps, which it won't, the GDDR6 really shouldn't pull that much current. You're going to be looking at about 3.5 watts of heat on that. This straight up doesn't need a heatsink at all. Like, this really shouldn't need a heatsink whatsoever, under basically any conditions. So yeah, ASUS basically took everything the Founders Edition was and they just made it better. So though there's not they've not really worked on the memory VRM much more than on what you saw in the Founders Edition. But yeah, this is absolutely freaking ridiculous compared to really any card ever. I can't actually think of a card that has a more powerful VRM off the top of my head right now. And I've looked at a lot of graphics cards, and I can't think of I straight up can't think of a stronger VRM. So yeah, and I think for a lot of the custom cards, when the custom cards start rolling out, we will be seeing more 16-phase VRMs. Definitely, we're going to be seeing more 16-phase VRMs. We might even see some higher phase counts, but I think at that point they're going to start running out of space on the PCB. And ASUS already ran into that because they had to extend the PCB a bunch just to cram that 16 phase on there. So this might be the limit. And you know what? If this is the limit, I'd say the limit is great. This is a very good limit to run into. So yeah, absolutely no complaints for me for the Strix card. It's just a straight upgrade over the Founders Edition, though it is worth noting you're probably not going to notice. Now then, what to do if you don't like NVIDIA's overly strict power limit? Well, ASUS makes this really easy because your freaking shunt resistors for the 8 pins are right next to the actual 8 pins, unlike the Founders Edition where the shunts are somewhere in this corner of the card for no apparent reason. I think it's actually to accommodate blower fans that they do that. Well, no, that doesn't make sense. Shunts are low profile. They could have stuck them anywhere. So yeah, if you want to lift the power limit, lift it off of the 8 pins. Don't lift it with this shunt down here. That one's hooked up to the PCIe slot. These are 5 milliohm shunt resistors. You can't actually read it, but it says R005 on them. And that basically tells you they're 0.00 0.05 ohms. And the best way to lift the power limit on the 20, if you want a permanent solution for lifting the power limit on a 20 series and you don't want to do the liquid metal thing because it may or may not dissolve your solder and cause other issues, as well as just being liquid metal and liquid metal being kind of a pain to clean up in some scenarios. Actually, in all scenarios, it's a pain to clean up. If you actually really want to do your power limit drop properly, my recommendation would be to just solder a 0.003 milliohm resistor right on top of the existing shunts. And if you do that, you're going to end up with a power limit that's about 2.6 times higher. Well, no, more like 2.7 times higher than stock. If you want even more of a power limit increase, then you're going to want to go with a 0.015 ohm resistor, and then you're going to get something like a 4.4x increase in power limit. At which point you really shouldn't be hitting the power limit at all. Even on liquid nitrogen, you shouldn't be hitting the power limit. For the power monitoring actual chips, if you want to do your power limit modifications the hard way, as in disconnecting the stock power limit monitoring circuitry and rewiring it, you're going to have to deal with these guys right here. And those are the same chips as on the Founders Edition. These are NCP 45491s. I would not recommend this because these have much smaller SMD components around them than what you would find on a 10 series card with the INA 3221. It's much easier to just deal with the shunts directly. So yeah, that covers the 2080 Ti Strix. I really, really like this card. It's just really unfortunate that, NVIDIA won't allow the board partners to let the cards stretch the VRM, so to speak, because yeah, this is going to be stuck around somewhere in this current range. just because of the power limits. But hey, if you want to, you can lift it, and at least you know that if you do lift it, you don't have to worry about the VRM here. At that point, you might have to worry about your power supply, and possibly I also wouldn't recommend, like, if you do lift the power limit to that 2.7 times level, I would recommend not using a daisy-chained 8-pin. Don't use one of those cables that is like one cable to the PSU and then 2 8-pins on the end, because at that point you're going to run the risk of actually melting the cables, because the card could actually go as far as pulling something like 500 watts down the daisy chain, and that can end very badly. So yeah, that's it for the board analysis here, and thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave comments, questions, suggestions down in the comments section below. And if you'd like to support what we do here at Gamers Nexus, then there's the Patreon, and there's also store.gamersnexus.net. Did I say that correctly? I tend to put extra dots in there. You can find a link to that in the description below, as well as in the comments section. You can pick up one of the mod mats, which is actually what this card is sitting on, and the one you'll be getting won't be as dirty as this one. So yeah, check that out. And if you'd like to see more of my stuff, I have a channel called actually Hardcore Overclocking, where I do a lot of hardcore overclocking. So yeah, thank you for watching, and goodbye.